Growing up on the farm was never a problem for me. The isolation, the vast landscapes, and the scent of the earth after the rain were, in a way, comforting. But the silence. The silence was relentless. It clung to the walls of our house, filled the spaces between meals, and whispered in the corridors at night. It was the kind of silence that screamed truths no one had the courage to say aloud. After my mother died, everything changed. I was only 6 years old when she left, and her absence left a void I could never fill. My father, Roberto, threw himself into work as if the farm could be his salvation, but little did he know it would also become my prison. He was never cruel, but he was never affectionate either. It was as if he had decided that any form of emotion was too dangerous to be felt. And me? I became a shadow, always there, but never truly seen. The nights were the worst. I used to curl up in the corner of my room, a book in hand, trying to fill the gaps in my life with stories of happy families and exciting adventures. The characters gave me what my father could not: attention, comfort, and above all, hope. But as much as I wanted to believe in those tales, I knew my reality was different. My father never spoke about my mother. It was as if mentioning her would open a door to something he refused to face. All I had of her was an old, faded photo that I kept hidden in the back of my drawer. I would look at it when the longing became unbearable, trying to remember the sound of her voice or the touch of her hands. But the more I tried, the more those memories faded. There was one question that constantly haunted me. Why did he never talk about the past? I knew almost nothing about my father's family, and any attempt to ask about it was quickly shut down with a stern look. I knew there was something there, something he was hiding, and deep down, it consumed me. I needed to understand. I needed answers to fill the holes in my story. The farm was an extension of my father's personality, functional, solid, but lifeless. Every piece of land seemed to carry the weight of something I couldn't comprehend. I grew up without knowing what affection or emotional support was, but somehow I learned to survive. However, surviving wasn't living, and I knew that. Looking back, I realized that all that loneliness shaped who I am. Perhaps it was that which gave me the determination to seek more, to not accept anything less than I deserved. But at the same time, I wonder, can emptiness make us as strong as it makes us fragile? The answer always seemed to slip away from me. In those years, I promised myself that, when I had the chance, I would leave that farm and discover what else the world had to offer. But I also knew that, in order to move forward, I would have to face the past. And the past, as I would come to learn, never truly lets us be. I always knew my father carried something too heavy to let anyone else touch. It was as if he had built a wall around himself, so tall and so thick that not even I, his only daughter, could get past it. He was not cruel, but his rigidity made our relationship a constant dance between silence and discomfort. Everything about him seemed designed to avoid feelings. His words were measured, his expressions controlled, and, above all, his pain locked away. As a child, I thought it was my fault. Maybe I wasn't good enough to make him smile, to make him feel proud. But as I grew older, I realized there was something much bigger buried there. Something he refused to mention, even when I asked innocent questions about our family. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with no clues. Gradually, small fragments of the past began to emerge. Not from him, of course. My father would never open up voluntarily. I discovered it through conversations I overheard between the farm's workers, through whispered words they thought I couldn't understand. The story always started with the same name: Teresa, my grandmother. The mother he rejected with an intensity that intrigued me. She abandoned him, they would say, left him when he was just a boy. This information was like a loose piece in a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to put together. My father was raised by relatives, People who, apparently, didn't treat him with love. The idea of being left behind by his own mother was too painful for me to even imagine. But still, something didn't add up. Why did she abandon him? And more importantly, why could he never forgive her? I remember one particular night. We were in the kitchen, and the yellow light from the lamp made the shadows seem longer. He was sitting at the table, drinking his black coffee, and I, filled with courage, decided to ask, "Dad, what was Grandma Teresa like?" My voice sounded hesitant but determined. He stopped, the cup halfway to his mouth, and gave me a look that could have frozen fire. "Never mention her name in this house," he said, his voice low, but heavy with something that felt like hatred. The conversation ended there. He stood up and went to his room, leaving me alone with a million unanswered questions. That was the first time I realized how much the past had broken him. He didn't want to remember, let alone talk about it. But no matter how much he tried to bury the memory, it seemed to haunt him in everything he did. I saw it in the way he avoided any display of affection, in how he worked tirelessly, as if he were running from something. Sometimes I wonder how my life would have been if he had allowed his pain to be exposed, if he had let me help carry some of that weight. But pride was his inseparable companion, a shield he used against the world, and against me. What I didn't know was that this same pride he used to protect himself would one day be the reason we almost lost everything. The letter arrived on a quiet morning, brought by the mailman who always wore the same smile and the same worn-out hat. I was on the porch, watching the wind play with the dry leaves covering the yard, when he extended the envelope toward me. It was simple, but the sender caught my attention immediately. Teresa Marias. My heart raced. My grandmother. The one I had never met, whose name was forbidden in our house. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, each line of the letter becoming a new wound, and at the same time, a revelation. She was sick, gravely ill, and wanted to see me. "I don't have much time," she wrote. "I want you to meet me before it's too late." I spent the entire day with the letter in my hands, rereading it as if the words were a puzzle I needed to solve. Why had she reached out now? And more importantly, how would I tell my father? I knew that any mention of Teresa would be like striking a match near gunpowder. I waited until dinner, when the usual silence at the table seemed less threatening. My father was busy cutting a piece of meat on his plate, and his expression was the same as always, distant and unshakable. I took a deep breath before speaking. "I received a letter today. From Grandma Teresa." He stopped, the fork halfway to his mouth, and gave me a look that froze me in place. "What letter?" His voice was low but sharp. I quickly explained, choosing my words carefully, but every sentence seemed to make the situation worse. When I finished, he stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor, and pointed at me with a trembling finger. "That woman deserves to die alone. If you walk out that door to see her, never come back." His words hit me like a blow. Never come back. Was he really willing to lose me over an old grudge? I sat there listening to his heavy footsteps as he climbed the stairs, while silent tears streamed down my face. I knew he was wrong, but that didn't make the decision any easier. I spent the night awake, my grandmother's letter beside me, as my heart fought against my mind. Going to see her meant disobeying my father and, possibly, losing the only family I had. But not going would be like giving up a part of myself, a truth I felt I needed to know. The next morning, I made my decision. I packed some clothes in a bag, grabbed the letter, and before leaving, I looked at the house where I had grown up. The air was heavy, thick with emotions that had never been spoken. As I walked down the dirt road, feeling the dust under my feet, I thought about everything I was risking. But deep down, I knew I had to do it. Not just for Teresa, but for myself. Something inside me told me this journey would change my life forever. The road to my grandmother's house was long and winding, as if fate were testing me with each step. With every kilometer I covered, my mind filled with questions. Who was this woman my father so despised? What was I about to discover? Part of me feared the trip would end in disappointment, but another part, a deeper part, felt that something important was about to happen. When I finally spotted the house, my heart raced. It was a modest building, weathered by time, but there was something welcoming about it, as if the walls held stories waiting to be told. The door was ajar, and the late afternoon light illuminated the entrance in an almost poetic way. I took a deep breath before stepping inside. She was sitting in a chair near the window, wrapped in a thin blanket. Despite the evident fragility, there was something in her eyes that made me stop. They were like mine, the same color, the same gleam. For a moment, I wondered if that shared trait was the only bond we had, but then she smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine, as if she had been waiting for me her whole life. "You came," she said, her voice weak but filled with emotion. "Thank you." I approached slowly, feeling as though each step was a dive into the unknown. I sat next to her, and she took my hand with surprising strength. For a moment, we sat in silence, just looking at each other, until she began to speak. Her words were measured, but each one carried immense weight. She told the story I had never known, the story my father never wanted to tell me. When she was young, she fell in love with a man my family had never accepted. Their love was like a fire that burned everything around it, including her stability. When she decided to run away with him, she left my father, still a child, in the care of relatives. The pain in her voice as she described that choice was almost tangible. I was lost, Helena. I made a terrible choice, and I've regretted it every day since. I tried to come back. I tried to win your father's love, but he never wanted to listen. He never forgave me. As she spoke, I felt my heart tighten. No matter how much I tried to understand my father's side, I couldn't help but see her suffering. She wasn't trying to justify what she had done, but she wasn't hiding the pain that had followed her either. She was a broken woman, but still, in some way, whole. "Helena, listen to what I'm going to say," she said, squeezing my hand. "Don't make the same mistake I did. Grief is too heavy a burden to carry. Pride destroys everything that's good." Before I left, she took an envelope from a drawer and placed it in my hands. Inside was money, an amount she had saved throughout her life. "Invest in your future, my girl. I want you to live a life full of opportunities, a life without the regrets I carry." As I made my way back home, with the letter and the envelope in my backpack, I felt that something inside me had changed. It wasn't just her story I now carried, but the responsibility to decide what to do with it all. The pain I saw in her eyes and the strength of her words echoed within me, like a call to face the past and perhaps find a way to piece together what my family had lost. The trip back home was heavy, but not because of the distance traveled. It was as if every word my grandmother had spoken was etched in my mind, each one pushing against the weight of the silence my father had always imposed. I knew I couldn't just walk through the front door and pretend nothing had happened. The envelope in my backpack was more than money. It was a kind of legacy, a symbol of something my father had never wanted to accept, his mother's regret. When I arrived at the farm, the sky was already beginning to darken. The familiar scent of earth and wood filled me, but this time, it didn't bring comfort. I opened the door slowly, expecting my father to be in the living room, but the house was quiet, as always. He was in his room, as he usually was after a long day of work. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to fill the silence around me. I found him sitting in his armchair, reading one of the few newspapers he still insisted on buying. When he saw me, he didn't say a word. He just looked at me, his face as rigid as stone. I knew I had to speak, but my voice seemed caught in my throat. I took the envelope from my bag and placed it on the table beside him. "She gave me this," I said, my voice low but firm. "She wanted me to invest in my future. She wanted me to know she regretted it, Dad." He didn't respond right away. He just stared at the envelope like it was a strange object, something he didn't know how to handle. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, rougher, but also more vulnerable. "I don't want to hear anything about her, Helena. You went against my will. You went to her knowing what that meant." "I did, yes," I replied, my tone rising slightly. Because someone needed to hear what she had to say. Someone needed to forgive her. He stood up, the newspaper falling to the floor, and stared at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to shout, but what came next was completely unexpected. "Forgive?" he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you think it's that simple?" "She abandoned me, Helena. She left me with people who didn't even care about me. I was a child, and she chose another life over me." I saw the tears begin to form in his eyes, but he held them back, as he always did. It was then that I realized how much he was trapped in the past, how that grief had shaped him, and for the first time, I felt pity for him. Pity, because he never allowed himself to feel anything other than pain. "I'm not saying it's easy," I said, my voice softer now. "But carrying this pain for so long has only destroyed you, Dad. She regretted it, I know that. And still, she never stopped loving you." He stepped away, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway as he went to his room. I stood there, alone, holding the envelope that now seemed so much more than just money. It was a reminder of what pride and pain could do to a family. That night, I wrote him a letter. I didn't know if he would read it, but I had to try. I needed to say what my grandmother never got to say to him in person. "Father, I know she hurt you. I know what she did wasn't fair. But I also know that you loved her. It's in you, even though you try to hide it. Forgiveness isn't for her. It's for you, so you can finally leave that weight behind." I left the letter on the kitchen table before going to bed. I didn't know what the next day would bring, but I hoped that somehow, this might reach the part of him that still wanted to believe in love. The next morning arrived with a different weight. The air in the house seemed lighter, though my heart was still uneasy. When I came downstairs, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table. He was holding the letter I had left. His eyes were fixed on the paper, but it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. For a moment, I hesitated to approach, but I knew this was the moment to close something that had been eating away at our family for years. "Did you read it?" I asked, my voice low but firm. He didn't answer right away. He simply placed the letter on the table and looked at me. There was something different in his eyes. Not exactly regret, but something close to it. "I read it?" he finally said. And for the first time in a long time, I listened. I sat down in front of him, my heart racing. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I always thought that if I admitted how much she hurt me, it would be like opening a wound that would never heal. But after everything you said, after reading this," he pointed to the letter, "I realized that what I was doing was worse. I was letting this pain control everything." His words were hesitant, but sincere. For the first time, he seemed human, vulnerable. "I don't know if I can forgive her completely," he admitted, his voice filled with emotion. "But maybe it's time to try." That moment was the turning point I never thought I'd see. My father, the rigid and unshakable man, was finally willing to face the past. And somehow, that gave me the courage to do the same. In the following days, I began to organize my life. With the money my grandmother had left me, I invested in a course I had always dreamed of: business administration. My plan was to open something that combined my passions with my determination to help others. A small cafe that could serve as a meeting place for stories, just like the ones that shaped my life. As I built my future, my father began to rebuild his as well. He decided to visit the old house where he grew up, a gesture that for him was as difficult as forgiveness. It was there that he found a childhood photo of himself with my grandmother, a memory he had never had the courage to look at until then. He returned changed, quieter, but there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't existed before. As for my grandmother, her legacy wasn't just the money she left me, but the words that changed my view of the world. She taught me that forgiveness isn't about those who hurt us, but about who we want to be. Her mistake was great, but her regret was greater, and that, in some way, gave me the strength to move forward. Today, as I write these words in my small cafe, I think about everything that happened. My life changed, not because I inherited money, but because I decided to break a cycle. I decided that I wouldn't live with the weight of pride and resentment, that I wouldn't let the past define my future. My father is now a regular customer here. He brings his newspaper and drinks the same black coffee, but sometimes I see a small smile on his face, something that rarely happened before. Maybe he still carries pieces of that pain, but I know that, little by little, he's learning to let them go. And what about you? If you had the chance to start over, to forgive, and to rebuild, would you have the courage to accept? Because in the end, it's not about what we've lost, but about what we choose to preserve. That's what my grandmother tried to teach us all. And it's what I choose to carry forward.